The fire had been dead for 16 hours, yet Malcolm Pritchard's cabin remained warm enough that he wore only a single shirt in the February darkness. Outside, the thermometer read 30 below zero, and his nearest neighbor was burning through his winter wood supply in a single desperate week. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable frontier innovation. Malcolm Pritchard had survived 8 winters in the Montana Territory, trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed into the Bitterroot Range. He was 32 years old, competent with an axe and rifle, careful in his movements through grizzly country, and remarkably successful at reading water for beaver sign. Men like Malcolm didn't become legends, but they survived, and survival in the northern Rockies during the 1830s was its own form of achievement. Most trappers lasted 3 winters before dying, giving up, or moving on to easier country. Malcolm had outlasted most of his contemporaries through a combination of skill, caution, and consistent decision-making that favored safety over glory. In the autumn of 1836, Malcolm partnered with Geoffrey Ramsey, an English immigrant who had come west 4 years earlier seeking adventure and fortune. Geoffrey was younger, 26, educated in a way that most mountain men were not, and possessed an enthusiasm that Malcolm found both refreshing and occasionally concerning. They established a camp near the confluence of 2 small creeks in what would later become western Montana, roughly 40 miles south of where Missoula would eventually be founded. The location was ideal for trapping, surrounded by beaver ponds and far enough from established trading routes to avoid competition from other trappers. Their cabin followed standard mountain construction of the era. They spent 3 days in early October cutting and notching logs, stacking them to form walls roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. The corners used simple saddle notches, quick to cut, and adequate for the purpose. They chinked gaps between logs with moss and mud, built a single door from split planks, cut 1 small window opening covered with oiled paper, and constructed a fireplace from stacked stones mortared with clay. The fireplace was typical: vertical stone walls forming a firebox roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, with a chimney extending through the roof. It took them half a day to build, using river stones and whatever clay they could dig from the creek bank. The structure was functional, which was all that mattered. The winter of 1836 to 1837 started mild but turned brutal in early January. Temperatures dropped to levels that made trapping impossible and simple survival the only goal. Malcolm and Geoffrey stayed in the cabin for days at a time, venturing out only to gather firewood or check their nearest trap lines. The fireplace worked adequately in calm weather, but when wind came from certain directions, smoke would back up into the cabin, filling the small space with choking fumes. This was common with frontier fireplaces. Most trappers accepted it as an unavoidable irritation and simply opened the door to clear the smoke, accepting the blast of cold air as the price of breathable atmosphere. On the night of January 14, 1837, a storm moved through their area, with winds strong enough to shake the cabin. The fireplace, which had been functioning normally, suddenly began pouring smoke into the interior. Malcolm tried the usual remedy of opening the door, but the wind was too strong and from the wrong direction. Instead of clearing the smoke, opening the door created a downdraft that made the problem worse. Malcolm spent the spring of 1837 finishing his trapping season alone. Geoffrey's death had transformed something fundamental in how he saw the wilderness. Before, dangers had been abstract possibilities that happened to other people. Now, they were concrete realities that killed partners 20 yards from shelter. He continued working his trap lines mechanically, processing pelts with the same careful attention he had always employed, but his mind was elsewhere. He had become fixated on a question that most mountain men never seriously considered. Why did everyone accept that cabins and fireplaces were built a certain way simply because that was how they had always been built? In late March, Malcolm began visiting other trappers' camps as he worked his way through the territory. He paid attention to their cabins and fireplaces with an intensity that others found peculiar. He saw smoke-filled interiors where men lived in constant respiratory irritation. He found cabins where trappers had abandoned their fireplaces entirely and used open fire pits instead, accepting smoke in exchange for avoiding the backdraft problems that plagued poorly designed chimneys. He talked to men who described sleeping in shifts during cold snaps because someone had to maintain the fire constantly or the cabin would become lethally cold within hours. A pattern emerged from these observations. Standard fireplaces were failing in consistent ways. They sent most of their heat straight up the chimney rather than into the living space. They produced excessive smoke because wood burned incompletely in the shallow fireboxes. They required constant attention because they had no thermal mass to retain heat after the fire died. They were vulnerable to wind conditions that could reverse the draft and fill cabins with deadly fumes. Mountain men accepted all of this as simply the nature of fire and shelter. Malcolm began to suspect that acceptance was the real problem. In early June, Malcolm left the mountains to sell his furs in St. Louis. The journey took 3 weeks by horseback, following established routes east through mountain passes and across the Great Plains. Most trappers arrived in St. Louis with months of isolation behind them and celebrated with enthusiasm that often consumed their entire season's earnings in a matter of weeks. Malcolm had always been more moderate in his habits, but this year he barely participated in the usual revelries at all. Instead, he spent 2 weeks walking through the city, studying how buildings were constructed. He watched brick masons working on a warehouse, noting how they interlocked bricks in patterns that distributed weight and created strength through geometry rather than just mass. He examined stone foundations, seeing how builders used precisely cut stones at corners and stress points. He spent an afternoon observing a blacksmith's forge, particularly interested in how the structure captured and radiated heat long after the fire had been extinguished. The forge was built with fire brick that absorbed tremendous heat during operation and released it slowly over hours. One detail caught his attention more than anything else. He watched workers at a forge shoveling out ashes at the end of the day. Malcolm returned to the Montana Territory in late July of 1837 with supplies that made other trappers question his sanity. Most men heading back to the mountains carried standard goods: powder, lead, coffee, salt, perhaps some tobacco or whiskey. Malcolm's pack animals were loaded with wooden molds for making adobe bricks, a set of metal grates in various sizes, specialized stone-cutting chisels, and 40 pounds of iron strapping. When Preston Blake, a trapper heading to similar territory, asked about the unusual cargo, Malcolm offered no explanation beyond saying he was building a better cabin. Malcolm selected a new location for his camp, roughly 15 miles from where he and Jeffrey had wintered. He chose high ground above the creek rather than building near the water, as most trappers did. The location meant hauling water uphill daily, but it provided clear sight lines and drainage. In early August, he began construction in a way that would have seemed utterly backward to any observer. Instead of cutting logs for walls, he started by digging a hole. The excavation took 5 days of brutal labor. Malcolm dug a rectangular pit 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep from front to back, and 10 inches deep into the earth. He removed rocks and roots, creating a smooth floor that sloped slightly toward the front. The August heat made the work exhausting, and black flies from the nearby creek made it miserable, but Malcolm continued with methodical determination. Rufus Carver, a trapper working territory 20 miles north, stopped by during the excavation. Rufus was a loud man who had survived 6 winters through a combination of genuine skill and aggressive self-promotion. He looked at Malcolm's pit and laughed openly. "You building a root cellar, Pritchard? Or maybe a grave for your common sense?" Malcolm continued digging without responding. Rufus pressed the mockery. "Jeffrey's death broke something in your head. Everyone knows it. You're out here digging holes when you should be building walls." Malcolm stopped, looked up at Rufus, and spoke quietly. "Jeffrey died because our shelter failed. I won't die the same way." Rufus shook his head and rode off, already composing the story he would tell other trappers about Pritchard losing his mind. Malcolm built stone support columns inside the pit, spaced 18 inches apart, rising from the pit floor to just below ground level. Each column was carefully constructed from flat stones mortared with clay, mixed with sand and grass. The columns would bear enormous weight, so Malcolm took 3 days to build them properly, allowing the mortar to cure between courses. Once the columns were complete and solid, he began laying the hearth platform. He had selected massive flat stones from a creek bed 2 miles away, hauling them on a travois he built specifically for the purpose. Each stone weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. He needed 14 of them to span the pit completely. The hearth platform was complete by late August, and Malcolm began the vertical construction that would define his fireplace's revolutionary design. He spent a week making adobe bricks using the wooden molds he had brought from Street Louis. The mixture was clay from the creek bank, sand, chopped straw, and water, combined in proportions he had learned by watching workers in the city. Each brick needed 5 days to dry in the sun before it was strong enough to use. Malcolm made them in batches, creating a supply of 200 bricks over 3 weeks while simultaneously cutting logs for his cabin walls. The fireplace rose from the hearth platform in a shape that violated everything mountain men knew about chimney construction. Malcolm started with a base 4 feet wide, laying adobe bricks in careful courses with clay mortar between them. But instead of building the walls vertically straight as every frontier fireplace was built, he set each course back 2 inches from the one below it. The structure tapered inward as it rose, creating a stepped pyramid that narrowed from a 4-foot base to a 2-foot chimney opening at the roof line. Sterling Doyle arrived during the 4th week of construction. Sterling was Malcolm's nearest neighbor, trapping territory 12 miles to the east. He was a practical man, skeptical by nature, and he studied Malcolm's emerging fireplace with obvious confusion. "Why are you making it narrower as it goes up? Smoke needs room to escape. Everyone knows you build chimneys straight or wider at the top to catch the smoke." Malcolm continued laying bricks as he responded. "Smoke doesn't need room, it needs speed. A narrow passage makes it move faster." Sterling shook his head. "That's backwards, Pritchard. You're going to smoke yourself out of your own cabin." The firebox itself was built low and wide at the base of the pyramid. Where traditional fireplaces had tall, narrow fireboxes elevated a foot or more above the floor, Malcolm's firebox opening was only 6 inches off the hearth platform and measured 3 feet wide by 18 inches tall. Inside the firebox, he installed one of the metal grates he had brought from Street Louis, positioning it to form the floor of the fire chamber. Below the grate, he created an opening that connected directly to the ash pit chamber beneath the hearth. Sterling returned a week later and saw the completed firebox with its unusual grate. "What's that grate for?" Malcolm was applying clay mortar to the interior walls of the firebox, smoothing the surface. Ashes fall through it into the chamber below. Sterling stared at the design, then laughed without humor. "You're going to store ashes under your fire?" "Dead ash doesn't produce heat, Malcolm. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." Malcolm looked at Sterling directly. "The ash doesn't need to produce heat. It just needs to stay hot." Sterling shook his head and left, convinced he was watching a man waste 2 months building an elaborate failure. The fireplace was complete by late September of 1837. Malcolm had spent 7 weeks on construction that most trappers finished in half a day. The stepped pyramid rose through his cabin roof, tapering from its 4-foot base to a narrow chimney opening barely 2 feet across. The entire structure was massive, using over 800 adobe bricks and consuming roughly a ton of clay, sand, and stone. Malcolm had built the cabin walls around the fireplace rather than adding the fireplace to an existing cabin, treating the heating system as the primary structure and the shelter as secondary. On September 28th, Malcolm lit the first fire. He was nervous in a way he rarely allowed himself to feel. 7 weeks of brutal labor would be validated or revealed as a wasted effort in the next few hours. He started cautiously, building a small fire from kindling and dry pine. Smoke rose from the flames and moved up the chimney cleanly. No backdraft. No spillage into the cabin. He added larger pieces of wood, building the fire to a size that would normally heat the space. The draw remained clean and strong. The first surprise came within 30 minutes. The cabin warmed quickly, despite the fire being positioned so low. Heat radiated horizontally from the firebox into the living space, rather than rising straight up to the ceiling. Malcolm could feel warmth at floor level, which was unprecedented in his experience. Traditional fireplaces heated the upper portions of cabins while leaving floors cold. This system distributed heat more evenly from the ground up. He maintained the fire for 4 hours, then let it die completely to test the system's heat retention. This was the critical experiment. He went outside to check the chimney while the fire was burning. Minimal smoke emerged from the top, far less than any fireplace he had seen. The wide firebox and preheated air from below were creating more complete combustion. He returned inside and waited. 2 hours after the fire died, the cabin remained comfortably warm. Malcolm touched the hearthstones. They were hot enough that he could only keep his hand in contact for a few seconds. He put his hand near the small opening to the ash pit chamber. Warm air flowed out steadily. The stone mass was radiating stored heat, exactly as he had theorized. He slept through the night without tending the fire, something he had not done in winters past. When he woke at dawn, the cabin was still comfortable. 8 hours after the fire had died, the hearthstones remained warm to the touch. The system worked for immediate heating, but Malcolm understood that this was only partial validation. The ash pit was still empty. His hypothesis was that the system would improve dramatically as ash accumulated over weeks and months, creating a thermal mass that would retain heat for extended periods. Preston Blake visited the next afternoon and entered the cabin to find Malcolm working on equipment repair. The winter of 1837 to 1838 was Malcolm's first season with the new heating system, and it transformed his experience of frontier life in ways that were difficult to explain to others. By December, the ash pit had accumulated 4 inches of ash from 2 months of daily fires. Malcolm began noticing that the cabin stayed warm longer between fires. What had been 8 hours of heat retention in September became 10 hours by November, then 12 hours by December, then 14 hours by January. He built his fire each evening, let it burn for 3 to 4 hours, then allowed it to die. He slept soundly through the night and woke to a cabin that remained comfortably warm until midday or later. The wood consumption was roughly half of what he had burned in previous winters. This wasn't a minor improvement. It meant the difference between manageable wood gathering and exhausting daily labor just to maintain fuel supply. Other trappers spent hours each day cutting, hauling, and splitting wood to feed their constantly burning fires. Malcolm spent an hour every few days and had more wood than he needed. Word spread through the scattered trapping community about Pritchard's strange fireplace, and men began stopping by to see it. The reactions followed a predictable pattern. They would arrive, note that no fire was burning, comment on how warm the cabin was, then ask when Malcolm had last built a fire. When he told them 12 or 14 hours earlier, they assumed he was exaggerating or that his cabin was simply better insulated than theirs. Sterling Doyle visited during a cold snap in January, when temperatures dropped below zero for a week straight. He arrived at mid-morning and found Malcolm inside without a fire burning. "I'm burning wood constantly and still freezing. You have no fire and it's comfortable in here." "How?" Malcolm led Sterling to the hearth and had him put his hand near the small opening to the ash pit chamber. Warm air flowed steadily from the gap. "Put your hand on the stones." Sterling touched the hearth platform. It was warm, not hot, but radiating steady heat. "That's just ash down there." "Dead ash from old fires." Malcolm nodded. "Dead ash that's still hot from yesterday's fire and the day before. And every fire I've built since September, the pit is full of it now. 6 inches deep, it holds heat for days." Sterling pulled his hand back as if the warmth itself was somehow wrong. "That's impossible. Ash goes cold." Malcolm shook his head. "Ash goes cold eventually. But if you keep adding hot ash from new fires before the old ash cools completely, the whole mass stays warm. The stones conduct the heat up into the cabin." "I'm heating with ash that stopped burning 2 days ago." Sterling left without saying much, but Malcolm could see he was thinking about what he had witnessed. Rufus Carver told a different story when he heard about the fireplace. February of 1838 brought weather that tested every structure and system in the Montana Territory. A blizzard was forecast by the subtle signs mountain men had learned to read. Unusual animal behavior, particular cloud formations, a quality to the air that spoke of incoming violence. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero 2 days before the storm arrived. Trappers prepared for a siege, stockpiling wood and supplies inside their cabins, knowing they might be confined for days. Sterling Doyle's cabin sat 12 miles east of Malcolm's location. Sterling had survived 4 winters using traditional methods, and he approached the blizzard with the same preparation he always employed. He stacked wood inside his cabin until he could barely move, knowing he would burn massive amounts to stay alive. As the storm began, he built his fire large and maintained it constantly. The traditional fireplace sent most of its heat up the chimney, so keeping the cabin warm required keeping the fire burning intensely at all times. By the second day of the storm, Sterling was in trouble. His wood supply, which he had thought adequate for a week, was disappearing at an alarming rate. He was burning through a full day's supply every 8 hours. The cabin remained cold despite the constant fire. Worse, the wind created occasional backdrafts that filled the space with smoke, forcing him to open the door to clear the air. Each time he opened the door, brutal cold and snow blasted inside, undoing whatever warmth he had managed to build. He was exhausted from constant fire tending, having slept only in brief intervals over 2 days. Malcolm's cabin, by contrast, had become a study in efficient heat management. The ash pit now contained 8 inches of accumulated ash from 4 months of daily fires. On the evening the storm began, Malcolm built a fire and maintained it for 4 hours, then let it die as he always did. He went to sleep while wind hammered the cabin walls and temperatures outside dropped to levels that could kill an exposed human in minutes. The cabin remained comfortable throughout the night. He woke on the second morning of the storm to find the cabin still warm 16 hours after his fire had died. The hearthstones were hot to the touch. The ash pit beneath, packed with thermally active ash from months of accumulated fires, continued radiating heat upward through the stone platform. Malcolm built another fire that evening, not because he needed it immediately, but as maintenance to keep the thermal mass charged. The fire burned for 3 hours. He went to sleep again, the storm still raging outside. On the morning of the 3rd day, someone pounded on his door. Malcolm opened it to find Sterling Doyle standing in the blizzard, snow-covered and exhausted. "My fire won't stay lit in this wind. I'm out of wood." "Can I shelter here?" Malcolm pulled him inside immediately. Sterling entered the cabin and stopped, confused. No fire was burning. The cabin was warm. "Where's your fire?" Spring arrived in April of 1838, and Sterling Doyle sought out Malcolm with a direct request. "I need to rebuild my fireplace. Will you help me?" Malcolm agreed, but established conditions immediately. "I'll show you how. You'll do the work. You need to understand how it functions, not just own one." Sterling accepted the terms without argument. What he had experienced during the February blizzard had eliminated any skepticism. He had spent 3 days in Malcolm's cabin waiting out the storm, watching the heating system operate, feeling the warmth radiating from stones above ash that had stopped burning days earlier. Understanding replaced doubt. The construction at Sterling's cabin began in late April and continued through May. Sterling experienced firsthand the brutal labor Malcolm had endured the previous summer. Digging the pit in rocky soil took 6 days. Building the support columns required precision Sterling had never applied to construction before. Making adobe bricks was tedious, repetitive work that tested his patience. "This is absolutely brutal," Sterling said during the 2nd week, mixing his 4th batch of adobe clay. Malcolm, supervising the brick-making process, responded without sympathy. "Would you rather freeze again next winter?" Sterling continued mixing. Preston Blake visited during the 3rd week of construction. Preston was younger than most trappers, only 24, but he had survived 3 winters through careful observation and willingness to learn. He watched Sterling laying the stepped courses that formed the pyramid structure and asked detailed questions. Why exactly 2 inches of setback per course? Malcolm explained the geometry, how the taper accelerated smoke velocity while maintaining Structural stability. Preston took notes on a piece of birch bark, sketching the dimensions and angles. Cornelius Aldrich arrived in early May. Cornelius was an elder of the trapping community, a man who had survived 15 winters and commanded respect through competence rather than self-promotion. He examined Stirling's fireplace construction with the careful attention of someone evaluating engineering rather than just observing labor. He asked Malcolm about the ash pit depth, the stone selection for the hearth platform, the clay mixture used for mortar. After an hour of examination and questions, Cornelius offered his assessment. The pyramid taper could be slightly more aggressive. 6 inches of narrowing over 8 feet of height would increase draft without compromising stability. Malcolm considered this and agreed. Cornelius continued, "I'm planning to build one at my camp this summer. This is the most significant improvement in frontier shelter I've seen." Rufus Carver rode past during the 4th week and stopped to observe the work. He had maintained his mockery throughout the winter, telling other trappers that Pritchard's fireplace barely functioned and that Malcolm was simply too lazy to tend fires properly. Seeing Stirling now building an identical system created cognitive dissonance. Rufus resolved through continued mockery, 2 fools now instead of 1. Next year you'll both be tearing these monstrosities apart. Stirling, laying adobe bricks in the midday heat, didn't bother responding. The winter of 1838 to 1839 marked a turning point in how trappers in the region approached cabin heating. Stirling Doyle's fireplace, completed in late May, had accumulated substantial ash by December and performed exactly as Malcolm had described. Stirling became a vocal advocate among trappers he encountered, describing the system's performance in concrete terms that other men could understand. "I build 1 fire per day. My cabin stays warm for 16 hours after the fire dies. I use half the wood I burned last winter. There's no smoke." These were measurable claims that addressed problems every mountain man faced. Preston Blake built his fireplace during the summer of 1838, following the notes he had taken during Stirling's construction. Emmett Sutton, a younger trapper in his 2nd year in the mountains, sought out Malcolm in June with genuine desperation in his voice. "I nearly died last winter. My cabin was frozen hell. Will you teach me?" Malcolm repeated the same condition he had given Stirling. "I'll show you. You'll do the work." Emmett accepted immediately and spent 2 months building his fireplace with an intensity born from having nearly frozen to death the previous February. By November of 1838, 6 ash pit fireplaces were operating in the Montana Territory within a roughly 80-mile radius. The trappers who had built them reported consistent results: extended heat retention that improved as ash accumulated, dramatic reduction in wood consumption, complete absence of smoke in cabin interiors, ability to sleep through nights without fire tending. The systems worked precisely as Malcolm had described, and the men using them told others. Rufus Carver's cabin experienced a chimney fire in January of 1839. His traditional fireplace had accumulated creosote from incomplete combustion, and the deposits ignited during a particularly cold night when Rufus was burning a hot fire. The chimney became a roaring column of flame that nearly spread to his roof. Rufus managed to extinguish it before losing the cabin, but the chimney was too damaged to use safely. He faced a choice: rebuild in brutal winter conditions or abandon his trap lines and leave the territory. He swallowed his pride and rode to Malcolm's cabin. Malcolm helped Rufus rebuild without mentioning any of the mockery from previous years. They worked in temperatures below 0. Rufus learning the construction techniques while his hands went numb. The new fireplace followed the ash pit design. Rufus said nothing about having been wrong, but his actions spoke clearly: enough. By spring of 1839, 12 ash pit heating systems were operating in the region. Trappers began calling them Pritchard fireplaces, a name that spread through the scattered camps and trading posts. Malcolm disliked the attribution. "It's just physics applied properly. I didn't invent heat or stone." But the name persisted because men needed something to call the design when describing it to others. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed between 1840 and 1842. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction in accessible areas, but the final blow came from fashion rather than ecology. Silk replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market that had driven thousands of men into the wilderness. The price for pelts dropped so low that trapping became economically pointless. Men who had spent years in the mountains faced a choice: find new reasons to stay or return to civilization. Malcolm Pritchard left Montana in the spring of 1843. He had saved his earnings carefully over the years and invested in farmland in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory. He married in 1844 a widow named Catherine who had crossed the Oregon Trail with her family. They started a farm, raised crops, and had 3 children over the following years. Malcolm's life became defined by planting seasons, harvest cycles, and the ordinary struggles of agricultural existence. He rarely spoke about his years in the mountains. To his family, he was simply a farmer who had once trapped beaver before settling into respectable life. But the fireplaces remained in the mountains. Abandoned cabins sat empty for months or years until new inhabitants discovered them. Prospectors, seeking gold in the 1850s, found cabins with unusual heating systems that still functioned after a decade of neglect. Homesteaders arriving in the 1860s and 70s occupied structures built by trappers and recognized immediately that certain fireplaces worked better than others. The ash pit systems, with their massive thermal mass and stepped pyramid construction, were maintained and used, while simpler fireplaces were often rebuilt or abandoned. The technique spread through practical demonstration rather than written documentation. A prospector who wintered in a cabin with an ash pit fireplace would describe the system to others. A homesteader who experienced the superior heating would build a similar design when constructing a new cabin. The phrase, "build it like Pritchard," became shorthand in certain frontier communities, though the name gradually lost its connection to the actual man. By the 1870s, trappers and settlers in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana were building stepped pyramid fireplaces with subterranean ash chambers without knowing who had developed the original design. Modern historians who study frontier architecture estimate that between 20 and 30 lives were saved directly by the superior heating these systems provided. The actual number is likely higher, but survival rarely generates written records. Countless others benefited from reduced wood consumption, better sleep during winter months, and improved air quality from smokeless combustion. These improvements don't appear in historical documents, but they represent the real legacy of functional innovation. Malcolm Pritchard died in 1869 at age 61 on his farm outside Eugene, Oregon. His death was noted in local records as the passing of a respected farmer and family man. His gravestone, still standing in a small cemetery, lists his name, birth, and death dates, and the names of his wife and children. There is no mention of Montana, trapping, or fireplaces.